Hi, this is Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Intra Arbor Solutions, and you're listening to BriefingsDirect. The last few years have certainly highlighted the need for businesses of all kinds to build up their operational resilience. With a rising tide of pandemic waves, high-level cybersecurity incidents, frequent technology failures, and a host of natural disasters, there's been plenty to protect against. As businesses become more digital and dependent upon end-to-end ecosystems of connected services, the responsibility for protecting critical business processes has clearly shifted. It's no longer just a task for IT and security managers, but has become top of mind for line of business owners too. Stay with us now as we explore new ways that those responsible for business processes in the financial sector specifically are successfully leading the path to avoiding and mitigating the impact and damage from these myriad threats. To learn more about the latest in rapidly beefing up operational resilience by bellwether finance companies, please join me now in welcoming our guests. We're here with Steve Yon, Executive Director of the EY ServiceNow practice. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
We're also here with Sean Culbert. He's Financial Services Principal at EY. Good to have you with us, Sean.
Good afternoon, Dana.
Sean, let me start with you. How have these risks that modern digital businesses face changed over the past decade, and why are financial firms at the vanguard of identifying and heading off these pervasive risks?
That's a good question. Financial firms, by definition, is a broad scope of firm types. So the risks for a consumer bank, for example, are going to be a bit different than the risks for an investment bank from a broker-dealer or wealth manager, but they all have some pretty common threads. There's a common thread around this expectation to be always on and edge computing, always being able to get to your data in a reliable and a secure way. There's been the integration of the ecosystem. So unlike product sets before, maybe a retail product and a brokerage product, and in some cases an insurance product, the customers expect that they can be brought together in one cohesive view for the customer. And that includes more integration points and more application types. And then kind of wrapping all of that, this need to be on the edge and always on has included increasingly reliance on third-party providers who have had to start to walk in step with the financial institutions in a way that they can ensure reliability. And in certain cases, that there's a learning curve involved, and we're still coming up that curve. It's a shifting set of expectations to the edge. It's different by category, but the themes of integrated product lines and being able to move across those product lines and integrating with third parties certainly has created complexity.
Steve, I have to imagine, too, that when you're a bank or a financial institute of some sort, that you're finding yourselves in headlines for bad things. It's very damaging immediately for your reputation and your brand. So why are banks and other financial organizations trying to be rapid in their response here beyond the obvious need for keeping out of the headline?
Well, yeah, it's not just about having the wrong headline on the front cover of American Banker on that. But as Sean talked about, the taxonomy, if you will, of how all these institutions are becoming more interrelated. The suppliers, they tend to be leveraging the same ones. Products and services tend to cross different firms themselves. The complexity of the financial institution space right now is high. And the consideration that if something starts to falter, because everything is interconnected, it could actually have a systemic effect, which is sort of what we saw a number of years ago that brought about Dodd-Frank on something like that. So, having a good understanding of how to measure and get telemetry on that complex makeup is important, because especially in financial institutions, it's about trust. You need to have confidence in where your money is and how things are going. So there's a certain expectation that has to happen, and you have to deal with that without mounting complexity. So the notion of resiliency is critical to a brand promise on that. Our customers are going to leave if you can contain it to just your own issue, but the fact that the Fed's going to worry about it if it becomes broader than any one particular firm because of how the nature of these firms are tied together. So it's increasingly important, not only from a brand perspective of maintaining trust and confidence with your clients, but also from a systemic nature of what it could cause to the economy if you don't have good reads on what's going on back here with support of your critical business services.
Now, Sean, the words operational resilience, maybe that comes from a regulatory backing, but for those who are new to this subject or listening for the first time, What does that mean broadly, Operation Resilience? How do you all define it? And what are the more perhaps legal or regulatory definitions that we need to consider as well?
We start with this notion of a service, and resilience is measured, monitored, managed around the availability, scalability, reliability, and security of a service. Understanding what the service is from an end-to-end perspective, how it enters into and exits the institution is the center of our universe. Around that, we have inbound threats, and operational resilience on the threat side is the ability to withstand a robust set of inbound threats. And for us, I mean, it's interesting. You asked the opening question around what's changed in the last 10 years. One of the important things that have changed in the last 10 years is the sophistication and complexity of the threats and the prevalence of them, quite frankly. If you look at the four major threat categories that we work with weather threats and cyber threats and geopolitical threats and pandemic threats. I mean, pick any one of those. And there's been a significant change in those categories. I mean, we have COVID. We have the proliferation of very sophisticated cyber attacks now that weren't around 10 years ago because of a lot of times leaks from government institutions. Geopolitically, there have been, obviously, we're all aware of tensions and weather events have become more prevalent. So it's a wide scope of inbound threats. And then on the outbound side, it's the ability not for the institution to report on those things, but rather to make decisions around how to either prevent those things. There's a hierarchy in operational resilience set. Can you remediate it being at the bottom? It broke, so can you fix it? Then you take a step up and it's can you detect it, which means that you can try to minimize the damage. And then kind of at the top of the pyramid is can you prevent it before it hits? So broad scope of threats against a broader scope of service assets that need to be managed with remediation was heritage, but now it's more about detection and prevention.
And to get in front of these and be proactive and preventative, it sounds like this has to be inclusive within the organization. It's not just one group of people in a back office somewhere that are responsible but the responsibility for this is shifted to more people and with perhaps even a different level of ownership. So how is the change over the past decade in terms of who's responsible and how you foster a culture of operational resiliency changed? And I'll throw it out to either of you.
We go back and, that anchor point is the service. And a service is processes, is technologies, facilities, third party, and people. So the folks that work very hard and work in each one of those silos, whether it's technology or third party management and the like, all have their view of the world, but the service is owned by the business. So what we've seen, a recognition of that is that the responsibility for sustaining that service falls with the first line. Steve, I'd welcome your thoughts.
So I think, right, there's a couple of ways to look at it. So one, Sean was talking about the lines of defense, and what I would say is, the evolution of risk and the thinking around risk and the operating models about how it is that they try to divvy up responsibilities that can basically have, line of sight ownership over certain sets of accountabilities, but also have the triangulation from others being able to inspect and audit those things as well. So the time is kind of right for, the type of solution that we're talking about now. One, because the nature of the world just got a lot more complex, which everybody is recognizing. Two, the technology is caught up with that greatly, with the whole move within the tech stack to become more utility-based, right, and service-oriented and objectified. The ability to get signal from how everything is operating and its status within that universe of tech has become a lot easier. And with the technology now being able to integrate across platform right now and operate at that service level versus at just the component level, allows you a view of something that it would have been very, very hard to try to synthesize years ago. So what we're really seeing here is, I'd say, a big shot in the arm to the power of what a typical risk resilience compliance team can now be exposed to manage their responsibilities at a much greater level versus before it would be, all right, develop those business continuity strategies and plans to, quote unquote, know what to do in the event of a fault or a disruption. And when those things happen, out come the 3-ring binders, the war room gets assembled, and people start to figure out what to do. They start running the playbook. The problem with that is that, while they're running the playbook, the fault has occurred, the disruption has happened, the clock is ticking, and all those impacts, the second order consequences of the problem are starting to amass with respect to value destruction, brand, reputational destruction, et cetera, as well as whatever customer impacts there might be. But now, because technology and moving toward that whole IoT sort of fundamental thinking where assets, whether they're people, facilities, third parties, et cetera, and you're not just your technology, can self-declare their state. And those can then be synthesized to then say, okay, as I start to see and pick up signal that's telling me that a fault is inbound or something looks like it's falling out of the control thresholds that they have, it now gives me the ability to get in front of something. That would be almost unheard of years ago. Because like I say, the nexus of tech and need and complexity are all sort of hitting right now, which is what's making the interest in moving and pivoting to this type of solution rising so much out in the field.
Many times we've also seen over the years shifts in technology or in business practices. They often happen first in finance and then percolate out to the rest of the economy. So I think it's important for us to focus on what's going on with the financial sector now. And these aren't just nice to have capabilities. There's also regulation at work. So what's happened recently with banking supervision and principles of operational resilience that have been issued that will keep the financial sector on the vanguard here. Again, to you, Sean, what's the big picture when it comes to the need to have...
And this is Steve. So before Sean takes off on that one, I would say that you'll see similar sorts of pressures coming from what I'll call any regulatory intense industry, finance being one of the key ones, but also power, utility, oil and gas, et cetera. You'll start to see it there as well. I'll hand it off to Sean because he can talk to you about kind of where it was and where it is. But I'd say that this sort of a trend is happening primarily first in regulatory intensive industries.
I guess a couple of years back, the Bank of England and the PRA had a consultation paper that was probably the most prescriptive recent consultation paper out of the UK, and we have the equivalent over here in the US around the expectations for operational resiliency. And that just made its way into policy or law, the Bank of the England policy on expectations of operational risk for financial markets institutions. And there's this presumption of reciprocity here in the US that it doesn't always hold true, but it does for the most part, that on a principles basis, we all share a common philosophy in terms of what's prudent. So a lot of the institutions, the major institutions, the ones we deal with, have looked at those major tenets in that policy and said, will be practice. There's really four fundamental areas that the institution has to focus on. One is, does it understand and can it declare and describe its critical business services? Does it have threshold parameters, logic assigned to those services so that it knows how far it can go before it sustains damage across a number of different categories? Are the assets that support those services known and mapped? Are they in a place where we can point to them and point to the health of them? And if there's an incident, collaborate around the sustaining of those assets. We said earlier, those assets generally fall into a small handful of categories. It's people, it's facility, it's third parties, technology, obviously. So, and then finally, do you have the tools in place to keep those services within those tolerance parameters and other alerting systems that let you know which of the assets may well be failing you if, in fact, the service is at risk. So it's a lay person's, obviously, and it's a very high level description of the Bank of England policy on operational risk for FMIs. But it really thematically, most of the institutions are focusing on those four areas, along with part of that tooling discussion is also around, do you have credible and actionable testing schemes in place to be able to simulate these disruptions on the inbound side? Coming on the back of Dodd-Frank, Dodd-Frank mandated that institutions declare which of those services could disrupt critical operations, that if those operations were disrupted, could disrupt the real economy. The operational resilience law, rule, and reg is a bit of a follow-on to that. It goes a level deeper. So now that you know what they are, can you risk rate them based on the priorities of the bank and its counterparties and regulators? Then can you manage them correctly? So that's whether it's letter of the law type regulation here and in Japan, or is more prudential-based regulation like the PRA Bank of England, it's all kind of falling into those common categories.
All right. Well, now that we understand the stakes and that there are these imperatives at work, we also know that the speed of things is tremendously increased. So the speed of business, the speed of expectation for the consumer, is all rising. So the need to cut the time to discovery to problems and to find root causes also has to be as fast as possible. So now that we understand the stakes, how do we start to get out in front of this? How do we help organizations move faster to their adoption of the ways that they can transform digitally, but also transform in terms of being resilient and able to head off problems? Let me start with you, Steve. How do we get fast? What do we have to start doing in order to get out in front and adhere to these regulations?
Yeah, so I think that once there's clarity around the shift in the goal, which is it's not good enough anymore to just be able to know what to do in the event of a fault or a potential disruption. But now it's more the expectation is prove to us prove to the regulatory bodies, prove to your clients who are looking to keep trust in you, prove to them that you can in fact withstand, absorb that potential disruption without impact to anybody downstream. So once people get their head around the nature of the expectations shifting to something that's a lot more preventative in nature versus reactive in nature, then I think the speeds and feeds by which they're managing those things become a lot easier to deal with than before. So, before, and I'll take you back to, all right, when I was running one of the tech arms at a super regional bank, the phone call at 3:00 in the morning that a critical business service is down, and you'll have the tech phone call that people are trying to figure out what happened because they started to notice at the help desk that a number of clients and customers were complaining that they didn't have access to something. So the clock had been ticking before 3 a.m. when I get the call, and the clients are upset on this. And now we're spending our time trying to figure out what happened, where did it happen, what's the overall impact, is there any other second order impact to this thing? Because depending on the nature of the issue, there could be other services that are disrupted as well. Again, back to the complexity factor and the interrelationships between the various components, right, that make up any service. And they're shared because that's how it is that people can get lean on things. And that's the risk that you take on something like that. So before it was speed literally killed because you had to figure a lot of these things out while the clock was ticking and the impact was going on. But now you're actually allowing yourself time to figure things out. And that's why we call it a decision support system that we're really after, because there'll be things that you can alert ahead of time to ensure that you've got, one, do I understand what the true blast area of this potential disruption is going to be? Second, based on that particular one, can I spin up the right levels of communications so that everybody that could be affected by that particular one knows about it? And then third, can I now get the right people on the call versus everybody hunting and pecking to determine are they the problem or are they not? And someone trying to synthesize that on the fly at 3:00 in the morning. So the nature of speed is still there when you've got to deal with an issue, but we're actually buying time for firms to be able to deal with the thing intelligently versus sort of in a shotgun approach without truly understanding the nature of the impact until the next day.
Sean, it sounds then like operational resiliency is something that never stops. It's an ongoing process. And that's what buys you the time, is that you're always trying to anticipate, get out in front of. You don't just start this up when the bad stuff hits the fan. Is that the way to look at it?
I think it absolutely is the way to look at it. I mean, there's going to be a time objective that will be specific to the type of service that we're discussing that, obviously it's going to be different from a consumer to a prime broker to a broker dealer and the like. So there was always this notion of a time objective attached to a service. But into my prior comment, which was critical service being something that, if disrupted, could disrupt critical operations, that could disrupt the real economy, that's come a lot more into focus in the last 10 years, since 2010. Because it really forced people to think through, if you were a broker dealer and you couldn't net your hedge funds positions, or if you were a consumer bank and you couldn't get folks to their paychecks the next morning, or if you were a broker dealer and their trading systems got hung up, put people in financial peril. Very different processes, three very different outcomes, but each one of them had a tolerance of fill in the blank time. So now it's just more of a matter of being accountable for those times. And so there's two things. There's the customer expectation that you won't breach those tolerances. And that notion of a time objective is specific to you, the client, or the customer's needs. And then the second, not new, but it's certainly the technology has made it more manageable, is the domino or contagion effect of one service tipping over another one. So now it's not just, is your service ready to go within its singular time objective of being up within half an hour, but is the knock-on effect to other relying services going to be affected as well? So it's become a lot more correlated in its requirement, in your requirement, the bank's requirement. We have to correlate services to one another. It's become regional. Something that might be a critical service in one business might not be in another, or in one region might not be in another. So it's become more of a multidimensional management problem in terms of categorically specific time objectives against specific geographies, against the specific, basically the regulation that's overhanging the whole thing.
Steve, you mentioned earlier taking the call at 3 a.m. It seems to me that we've got a different way of looking at this now, not just taking the call, but making the call. What's the difference between taking the call and making the call, and how does that help us prepare for better operational resiliency?
It's just sort of a fun way that we look at how a day in the life of your chief resiliency officer or your chief risk officer could go when something like this happens. So you could take the call from the CEO or someone from the board wondering why something is now failing and what you're going to do about it. And then you're caught on your heels trying to figure out what was going on, versus making the call, letting the CEO or the board member know that, hey, these were the potential disruptions that the firm was facing today. And this is how we weathered through it without incident and without damaging service operations or going to a place in service operations that would have been deemed as unacceptable. So we like to think of it in terms of, not only are we trying to prevent impact to the clients themselves, the firms, the customers of the firms, and protecting the nature or preventing the nature of and possibility of a systemic problem, but we're also thinking that it could potentially increase the lifespan of a CRO or somebody else there who shows that they can in fact be responsible for the firm's uptime versus just answer questions post-disruption in terms of what happened and what do I think we need to do so that it doesn't happen again. So it's more of providing a little bit of levity, but truth in that too, that there are more than just the consequences that one would think to the clients, but those people also responsible for that function within the firm itself.
Now, many of the leading edge organizations have been doing digital transformation for some years now. We're certainly in the thick of it after the COVID requirements of at-home work and doing everything digitally rather than in person. It's really picked up the pace and extended the breadth and depth of digital transformation. But when it comes to finance and the services that we're describing, the interconnections and the interdependencies are vast. There are third parties, there are APIs, there are cyber resiliency requirements that cut across organizational boundaries. Having a moat around your organization, for example, is just no longer enough. That means you have to know yourself, even though it's highly complex. So what is it about the way that ServiceNow and EY are coming together that help get to know yourself despite that complexity, that then puts you in a position to make an operational resiliency ongoing process possible? I'll throw that out to either one of you. What's this about knowing yourself that's an essential first step, and how are you able to help organizations do it?
I'll start this, and then I'll ask Sean, because there's really two components to this particular thing. And if you ask yourself, what needs to be true for the outcome that we're talking about to be valid? From a supply side, what needs to be true is, do I have good signal and telemetry across all of the componentry and assets and resources that would pose a threat or a cause for a threat to happen, or a down service if they were to change state? So with the move to digital transformation, like you're saying, more and more of the assets and resources that compose any organization are now able to be accessed, where, again, the state of that particular asset in terms of its preferential operating model are going to be known. So I need to have that. And that's what digital transformation provides. Second, what do I need? I need to have a platform that's got wide integration capabilities, that has workflow at its core, and can have the ability to perform business logic and conditional synthesis in terms of how to interpret the signals that are coming from all these different systems. And what is great about ServiceNow is that there hasn't been anything that it hasn't been able to integrate with. Then it comes down to, okay, do I understand the nature of what it is that I'm truly looking for? And that's where it is. I'll have Sean to talk about what a business service and what EY brings with respect to understanding the industry and what good looks like with respect to a business service and its construction. But then once I'm able to capture that control, if you will, determine its threshold, see that there's a trigger, and then be able to drive the workflows to get something done. For example, we've lost the trading, we're losing this building here, so we're losing the trading floor in City A. Therefore, I know that I need to bring City B and its employee list online to make them active so that I can get that thing up and running. ServiceNow can drive those things automatically within the platform itself, or drive itself for a human to be able to provide the approvals or notifications, if it will, to drive that workflows as part of your BCP plan going forward. So with respect to knowing what to do, saying that I can detect and interpret signal, and then based on that, I can act on it. That's what ServiceNow brings. To make the solution complete, I need to know what that service construction is and what it means within the firm itself. And that's where EY comes to the table with it. And Sean, if you wouldn't mind, I'd ask that you talk a little bit about that.
The thing we needed first, and ServiceNow brings to the table, is we needed scale and we needed the ability to a logical and straightforward way to integrate. Right? And without that, there was this notion that we could be cross-silo and this notion we could be cross-product and geo is, without scale workflow and solid integration capabilities, that just wasn't going to happen. Add to that, and they talk about regulatory burden, and in a weird way, at least in my world, it's a bit of the opposite effect, which is when we start talking about signals from everywhere against all services that could speak to anybody that could fix it, it's a sprawl that feels very, from an implementation perspective, it's not implementable. The partnership with the regulators that has had us focus on what's most important, why it's most important, whether it's to the market or your balance sheet or your customers or law, rule, or reg, but what are not the 300 services, but what are the 2 dozen services that are important? That gives us a big step forward in terms of being able to scope our ServiceNow implementation. And then from there, what are the dimensions associated with that service that we should be capturing on a real-time basis to get up from remediation to detection to prevention? We have to be judicious in terms of the signal we're taking in. We have to be correct, and we also have to be right, which are two different things, obviously. So between the two, our requirement, our obligation to declare and describe what is critical, across, like I said, to our counterparties and our people and our shareholders in the markets, on top of a scalable, integratable technology, ServiceNow. That's the big step forward.
The other piece on that is from an accelerant standpoint, because if you look under the hood of most firms, you'll find ServiceNow that's there. And when you'll see that there's already been work done in the risk management area, so the concept and knowing what it means to deal with policies and controls, right, and triggers and simulations, and then within asset management and knowing the nature of what a CMDB is. These are all accelerants that could be used, back to what Sean was saying, is to not only provide scale to get something done, but provide speed, because so many of these things are already identified there. Then it's just a matter of associating them correctly and calibrating it, as Sean was saying, to what's really, really important so that you don't end up with a science fair integration project.
All right, what I'm still struggling to pull together, to thread together, is how the EY ServiceNow Alliance Operational Resilience solution doesn't just have a plan in place, but becomes that proactive early warning system. Explain to me how you're able to implement this solution in such a way that you're going to get those signals before the crisis reaches a crescendo. That's what I'm not quite clear on yet.
Okay, so let me take a stab at this particular one. So let's first talk about EY will come with an understanding from the industry about the firm itself and a view in terms of what good looks like with respect to what a critical business service needs to be. So we'll be able to kind of hone down to, all right, let's talk about payments or let's talk about trading. This is what it is that we need to sort of map out. Based on that, they'll also say, okay, in the deconstruction of that particular service, which we also bring as an accelerant to say these are all the different resources and assets and procedures that go into place to actually make that thing active. We know what that looks like. Then within ServiceNow and how it is that it manages and discloses and exposes assets can then associate those things in a tool relatively quickly in terms of here's what it is that we're looking for. Here's the signal that we're looking to calibrate on. And based on what it is that ServiceNow knows how to do, I could put a control parameter on this thing with a threshold to give me an indication that something might be approaching a fault condition. So within the nature of how it is that GRC or risk management is in fact looked at, we basically look at all of those different leading indicators and put telemetry around those things to say, okay, when something looks like my trading volume is starting to drop off right now, before it drops to zero, is there something going on all right? So it's basically popping up a signal that's looking to say, these are the possible dimensions that can start to indicate that something is not operating per its normal expected behavior. That would be one of those. That is then captured. It's then synthesized, displayed, and then either within ServiceNow itself could be automated to start to run some of its own tests on it to determine if it's valid or not, but at least alert the people who are responsible that something looks amiss and it's not operating within the control thresholds that were already set up within ServiceNow against those assets, to give people time to then say, okay, am I looking at a potential problem here, or am I just looking at a blip and it's nothing to worry about?
And Sean, because this is an ongoing process, that this isn't where you bring out those loose leaf binders when there's a problem, it sounds to me that there's a learning process here, that there's a data gathering process. Is that the way you should look at it when you move towards an ongoing process? Are we in a constant mode of learning? And is there even perhaps a level of automation at work when we have this progress through over time? Do we get a whole greater than the sum of the parts after a while?
The answer is, in short, is yes and yes. There's learning and there's automation. I mean, we bring to the table some highly effective regulated risk models, rather. I mean, there's a five-pillar model that we've used where market and regulatory intelligence feeds risk management, feeds surveillance, feeds analysis, and ultimately feeds policy enforcement. And how the five pillars work together within ServiceNow and work together within the business processes within the organization is where we get that intelligence feeding risk, feeding analysis, surveillance analysis, and enforcement. That workflow is the differentiator. So understanding whether it's immediate risk or concentrating risk, having history on, and obviously no one's can be 100% perfect on it, having context and perspective on the origin of the risk, whether it's a new risk, whether it's something that's going to create a lot of volatility or not, whether it's something that the institution has faced off against before, being able to rationalize that risk, and more importantly, rationalize the lack of a risk too, at least at the onset of a project. A lot of false positives come through that pipe. So is my market or regulatory intelligence mechanisms, are they feeding us only the stuff that's really important? Our risk model should be able to tell us that. And that risk model usually takes on, a couple of different flavors. One, a flavor that wouldn't be dissimilar to what you would think of almost like a FICO score, right? So do we know the risk? Have we seen it before? Is it characterizable in terms of where it's coming from and its management in the past? And then something probably more akin to a VAR calculator. What kind of volatility is this risk going to bring to the bank? Is it somebody that's recreationally trying to get into the bank, or is it a state actor? So once it gets that false positive gets escalated and disposed of, if it's in fact a false positive, then being able to plug it into something that is robust enough to surveil for where that risk is headed is really the only way to get out in front of it with, and that's that next pillar, the analysis pillar, to say, okay, who should we talk to about this? And how do we communicate, that this is a bigger than a bread box, much bigger than a bread box, real crisis type risk? What form does that communication take? Is it a full-blown crisis management communication? Is it a standing management communication or protocol? And then ultimately, and this goes to something that ServiceNow does very, very well, which is, can we take that effective function and very quickly understand the health of the resiliency around that function? We use our own proprietary model, which is, it's actually a military model that's used for nuclear power plants and grids and whatnot, in terms of being able to shift from primary states to alternative states, contingency and emergency states. But can you give the person at the end, the person who's in charge of policy enforcement, the tools to understand where they should be trying to fix that primary state issue, or moving it, step aside or step away aside, or if things have gone, so we're into contingency at that point, or things have gone well off the rails, do we have to shift into an emergency state? So that's from our perspective, it is constant learning, but there are kind of fundamental pillars that these events flow through that get the problem to the right person and gives that person options for minimizing the risk.
All right, Steve, do we have any examples or use cases? And I know it's not possible to always name companies in a sensitive capacity like this, but maybe just walk us through a use case and perhaps one that illustrates how alerting the right people with the right skills at the right time is an essential part of resuming critical business services or heading off the damage. So examples that highlight the role of people, because we haven't talked about people too much yet.
Without naming names, this is clients we have within EMEA in the UK. And one of the things that became, when the look on, when the fallout from the pandemic that we all have been experiencing or still experiencing, right? This really brought a lot of things to light, especially around, hey, this is an area now that we need to take account for in knowing our posture with respect to our ability to continue to operate in the way that we want to. So one of the things, let's talk back about integratability. Where are we going to get a lot of that stuff from? Workday. We'll go ahead and use them as say their HR system of record. Within there, one of the things that we're looking at is here's a critical business service owner who's going to be retiring soon. Now that sounds great. That's wonderful here. But one of the valid things that they say for this critical business service to be considered operating in its normal state was that not only do all the subcomponents and technologies and operating methodologies and suppliers be doing what it is that they're supposed to be doing, but I need to also look for a check to say, do I have an owner for this one who can cut through the nature of issues and the process itself and lead this thing going forward? Because if I don't have an owner identified for it, I'm going to consider myself at risk for this service not to be able to maintain its continuity, nor, how it's going to be evolving. So here's a simple use case where someone could be looking at a trigger that's going to come from Workday that's going to say, is this person still in this role and are they active? And if there's going to be a control around, okay, if I know that they're going to be inactive within X number of months' time, get on that, because then the regulators will look at this particular process as potentially being out of control because there is no point of the pyramid in terms of how it's going to run. So there's a real simple use case that has nothing to do with tech, but again, shows the integratability of ServiceNow into another system of record, turns it into ServiceNow into a decision support platform that can then drive the right actions and orchestrate the right actions to not only detect when a disruption to what is considered valid in the future is at risk, but gives you the runway and gives you that time to get it taken care of before the fault actually happened. I hope that made sense.
I'm afraid we're getting close to our end of time, but I did want to drill down a bit on this issue of personas. So the EY ServiceNow Alliance Operational Resilience Solution is under the covers, perhaps, to some of these personas, that first line of business owner, for example, but it's powering their ability to be in front of problems. So perhaps, Sean, you could illustrate a little bit about how your solution enables the personas, even though they might not even know that it's this particular solution that they're reacting with to.
That's a great question. I mean, for the last 6 or 7 years, we've all heard the shift is from the second to the first line in terms of primary ownership of. It probably goes back further than that, but I've heard many occasions of first line business managers saying, if it is my job, first of all, I need to know what the scope of my responsibilities are, and then I need the tools to do my job. And that persona of the frontline manager having good data that's not a false positive, that's not eating in her ability or his ability to make money, that is providing them with options in terms of where to go to minimize the issue, is that persona is evolving. And it was difficult for risk managers to really move solidly into the first line without these types of tools, and there were kind of interim management levels, someone that's at between the first and the second line, level 1.5, line 1.5. And it's clearly pushing into the first line. It's being able to say, here's your role and scope as it relates to the risk to the service. And now here's the tool that you can use to be not only responsible for it, but responsive to it. That's the big thing in terms of the design. And also some of these personas are evolving. And that's the nice thing about what we've done with ServiceNow over the last several years, which is as long as the base data is being correctly managed, then being able to reconfigure the data and recalibrate the threshold logic to accommodate a certain persona is not a coding exercise. It's a no code exercise. It's a no code step forward to say, okay, this is now the role and scope, and that role and scope will be enabled in this way, and these are the screens that matter, and this is how we're going to direct signal and options. Yeah, but it's all between the definition of a service. Do we all agree end to end what it is? And then the definition of the persona. Do we all understand who's accountable and who's responsible? Those two things coming together with a set of tools that are right and correct right. That's it. That's the gasoline.
And just to go back to the one comment about the call at 3:00 in the morning, that was the tech call. But typically what happens is there'd also be the business call. So one of the issues that we're also solving with ServiceNow is in one system, we can manage the nature of information where that irrespective of what your persona is, you have a view that can be tailored to what it is that you care about, and all the data is congruent back and forth. So it becomes a lot more efficient and a lot more accurate for firms to manage the nature of understanding on what things are, where there's not like I say, the tech community talking in terms of the issue, the business community wanting to know what's happening, what's next, and then someone translating in between. This is a real-time way for all those personas to become aligned around the nature of the issue with respect to their perspective.
Well, I really look forward to the next in our series of discussions around operational resilience, because we're going to learn more about the May announcement of this scenario solution, who it impacts and how it works. But as we're closing out today's discussion, more of a contextual look at the landscape and why this solution is so imperative now, let's look a little bit to the future. And we mentioned earlier that almost any highly regulated industry will be facing similar requirements. Where does this go next? Let's start with you, Sean. Where can this go in terms of not only the breadth in industries, but it seems to me that the more that things like machine learning and artificial intelligence and starting to drill into other sources of data to help feed this system and then therefore make it more powerful are happening. So what should we look to as we sign off for encouraging signs that if you take these steps now, there's quite a ramp forward into how this can be used for even more powerful exercises and implementations?
If you get the framework set up correctly so that you understand that you can apply artificial intelligence to the thinning out of false positives for marking or tagging certain events as either credible risk events or not credible risk events, the opportunity of AI to be used to direct these signals to the right decision maker. But instead of to take the human analyst out of the equation, to understand whether or not a signal is it's signal that should be paid attention to, a signal, and it should be brought to this person. AI is going to help us. It's going to be leaps and bounds. But you can't do it without that framework.
Yeah, and not only that, what Sean is saying is absolutely true, that all of those things will become now enabled to this type of, different set of data coming in as you start to say, okay, what do I want the picture to look like? And my ability to simulate these particular things, right? It all starts to go up, especially using ServiceNow. But also understand this, that back to the comment on complexity and the fact that suppliers don't just supply one client. They're connected to many. So as this starts to take hold in the regulated industries, and it becomes more of an expectation for a supplier to be able to operate this way and provide these signals and these integration points and the telemetry and transparency that people expect. Anybody else trying to lever into this is going to get the lift and the benefit from suppliers who realize that the nature of playing in this game just went up. But then that would be available to a much broader landscape of industries, if you will, for those suppliers.
Yeah, it sure seems to me that when we put 2 and 2 together, we come up with a greater sum, because not only are we going to be able to deal rapidly with the known knowns, but we're able to put in a system that can react to the unknown knowns or unknown unknowns. So that's an important characteristic that will set us up for a much brighter future, even if we hit another unfortunate series of years like we've just suffered. Well, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. You've been listening to a sponsored BriefingsDirect discussion on the need for businesses of all kinds to build up their operational resilience. And we've learned how those responsible for business processes in the financial sector specifically are successfully leading the charge to avoid and mitigate the impact and damage from myriad business threats. These new imperatives to achieve operational resilience are sure to spread, as I said, to nearly all businesses and sectors in the global economy in the next few years. So please join me in thanking our guests. We've been here with Steve Yon, Executive Director of the EY ServiceNow practice. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you.
And we've also been here with Sean Culbert, Financial Services Principal at EY. Thank you so much, Sean.
Thanks, Dana.
And a big thank you as well to our audience for joining this Briefings Direct Operational Resilience Innovation discussion. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host throughout this series of ServiceNow and EY-sponsored Briefings Direct interviews. Thanks again for listening. Please pass this along to your business community and do come back next time.